since Brother David brought it up, just to be clear on here, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again and again because people watch the YouTube videos and all. This chat is set up by Virginia Research Lodge, primarily by me. It's meant for Masons. We are not making it exclusive to Master Masons. There is no way we can have a whole long conversation about how you can't tile the internet, but the short answer is you can't tile the internet. So all I ask is if you are a Mason, that's great. If you're an EA or Fellowcraft potential Mason, you are more than welcome on our group to sign up for the emails, to attend the Zoom meetings, because there's nothing here that we can't put out on the web for anyone to see, because I put it out on the internet for everyone to see. It's a very simple standard. We never discuss anything that's secret. We're not going to have any discussion of ritual or passwords or anything that we would consider secret work. We kind of talk around it if we have to, but we never discuss anything that a non-Mason could include. And I'd rather be inclusive than exclusive at the moment. Yeah, we are the Wild West, Brother Brian. We are not vetted. And I think that was the issue your brother had with you, is if you claim to be vetted, we are not vetted. So if anyone here has an issue, we are the Wild West. I kind of like that. And it fits in with today's topic about Sam Houston. But I've had female Masons, at least one or two, come on here, and I haven't made an issue of it because I'm trying to be a polite host. We're not tiled. So I'm sure there are people on here who are clandestine to me. Doesn't matter. Okay, we're trying to be more universal about Masonry and sharing information with people. It's not a tiled lodge. One of the big discussions I see, especially on the mostly Prince Hall groups that are about clandestine Masonry, because they have a bigger problem than we do by far, is, you know, that people just don't understand. You can't really lock down the internet and only let people in who you recognize. So, you know, I'm just kind of inclusive. And if I get you to, if you're a clandy and you attend this and you realize that regular Masonry is better and you join a regular lodge, then all's the better. And that's the way I am about anything Masonic that I share online. You know?
Until I got mixed up with you lot, i.e. the Americans, I never knew what clandestine meant.
What's that?
Until I got mixed up with the American lodges, I never knew what clandestine meant. It's something we don't have over here.
Well, what do you? Okay, let's say if there. Okay, the Grand Orient of Italy, the Southern, is not recognized by the Grand Lodge of England. So how would you refer to them? Just not recognized?
The chances of seeing someone from the Grand Lodge, Grand Orient of Italy in a UK lodge is so remote. It's unbelievable.
I know, but still, if you had to refer to them in discussion, what do you say? Not recognized? Or
on Zoom, I would just refer to them. In the lodge, I would never know. It'd probably be, unless they actually said. We don't go into asking for dues cards or anything.
No. I understand that, but I mean, I'm saying if we're having a discussion about recognition, say some Grand Lodges are recognized by us, some are not. So not recognized. I mean, in Virginia Ritual and in our Methodical Digest, we specifically use the word clandestine.
Right.
And in our context, it's not any kind of a slur. It's just simply clandestine is anyone who is not in a regular lodge that we recognize as a regular lodge. I mean, if you want to get into the specifics,
it's not chartered.
A good example is you in the UK do not United Grand Lodge England does not recognize the Grand Orient of Italy, which is in the south, and that's where I attended lodge in Naples. There is the Grand Lodge of Italy that you do recognize, but Virginia does not, and I think that's more to the north. I'm sure there's overlap. I'll have to go do a paper on it someday, because I found that interesting when I got to go over there in '95. We in Virginia recognize you and the GOI. You recognize the GLI, whatever they are, but not the GOI. So I could go to your lodge and I can go to their lodge, but you can't go to theirs. So we're all regular Masons because another regular Grand Lodge recognizes them. So clearly they're regular to someone. But you can get in a whole big discussion about all of the regular Grand Lodges out there that are regular and recognized by other Grand Lodges. If you were speaking in a generic sense, I would say a clandestine Mason is someone who their Grand Lodge is not recognized by anyone. They're spurious, they're fake, they're bogus. They're irregular. There's a whole bunch of names for it. And there's been some really interesting talks on some of these groups about the guys who are in these bogus lodges come and they try and pass themselves off as regular Masons, and they're not. And we try to persuade them. It's like, look, if you want to be a Mason, great. Come join Masonry, because what you're in is not. Sorry. We had a running joke about you might, if such and such is true. It was like you might be a redneck. It's like you might be a bogus Mason. Like if the Grand Master and the master of your lodge are the same person and they've been there 12 years, you might be a bogus Mason, and so on. If there are only 3 lodges in your Grand Lodge and they're all in the same city, you might be a bogus Mason, and so forth. I want to welcome Brother Jason Hicks, the only one who dressed for the occasion because he's the speaker. Good to see you, brother.
Good to see you.
We are casual here. I make an effort to at least wear a collared shirt, and it's winter, so I'm wearing a plaid shirt. But we appreciate you dressing up. It's not required, believe me. And Brother Junior, good to see you again.
Good morning. Great to see you too. We just had Masters and Wardens for Richmond, so it's good to be here.
Oh, excellent. And we just had Brother Mark Irwin join. Say hello, please. And what lodge you from?
Temple Lodge, 649 in Canada.
Excellent. Just Canada. Not even a province.
Ontario.
That large. Ontario. See,
Ontario.
now I keep trying to find somebody who's not from Ontario. All you guys are from Ontario. That we see. I don't know.
Big
why.
province.
I guess so. Brother Tripp, good to see you. Please introduce yourself. And unmute before you do.
Hi, I'm Chris Tripp. I'm the master of Fredericksburg Lodge 4, and
excellent.
yeah, it's a pleasure to be on this morning.
Nice to have you here, friend of Brother Shelby's. Well,
Yes,
I don't know.
indeed.
Okay, knowing Brother Shelby, someone who at least knows Brother Shelby, but I'll go out on a leap and say your friend. He is someone's actually more controversial than me, which is kind of fun.
He can be, yeah.
Great guy though. He's often here. He normally jumps in. Brother Aday, good to see you again. So we'll be starting in a few minutes. We actually have more people here than we had last week. So we had a high water mark. Unfortunately, last week, I had really hoped, and I'm really kind of disappointed that we didn't get more people. I had hoped to have a really big crowd, and the whole round robin thing would have been better with more people. We only had 8. I think we got up to 10, maybe 11 at one point. For some reason, it was just an off week. I asked in the group if people would say, you know, was it the topic that put you off and kept you from coming? And no one said, yes, it was. So I was worried that I'm trying different things, and I'm trying to try different things. And some weeks we'll have a panel. Next week, we're going to have a panel discussion. This week we're having a speaker, which is the normal form. We do a little of this chit chat, and then we get to our speaker, and then we talk, ask questions, of him. And last week I tried something different, which was I had a whole list of questions, and I just basically throw a question at every single person in the chat, and everybody gets to participate. And I think that's good to get you all involved, to get everybody, to have a chance to say something about where they're from. And we got some good discussions. We learned about ramps, which is the usual vegetable from North Carolina. And I thought it was great. It just would have been better if we had more people. So I'm glad we got a few more this time. Brother Hicks will be speaking about Sam Houston, who is a well-known Mason, and anyone from Texas would certainly know who he is, and he'll be able to elaborate on that. Anybody want, if I haven't asked you, I think I've made everybody at least introduce yourself. Anybody got anything they want to share before we go to the speaker? We're going to give a few more minutes for more people to dribble in. This is your chance. Speak up. Say hello. Take something off your chest, what have you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Boo Boo. I hope you got a perched tail.
See, I'm unable to multitask. I can't talk and type at the same time. I hope everybody those of us who are, I think we have a lot of Brits here, don't we? We have at least a few. Everybody here in the U.S. And Canada is doing well and not suffering from the ice storm. We avoid it for the most part of Virginia. We've had a bit of rain, and that's all we ever seem to get. We don't seem to get a lot of snow. So I know it's been a rough on some people out there, and I do sympathize with those brothers who are having a rough time of it. Okay, from those of you who are here, are your lodges meeting once again because of COVID, at least in a partial state? Is anybody actually meeting again?
Yes.
Okay. Oh yeah, well you're in Virginia, same boat as me. Yeah, we're limited to 10 members right now. We're hoping that's going to change. Okay.
Yeah, brother, in DC, we actually do have a provisional form ritual so that we can do tiled meetings.
Online.
Yeah, so we've been doing that. We basically use the Zoom function where you get to see like a waiting room of people, and if you limit the link distribution, of course, and then we don't do any testing of someone new. It's only known brothers who can attend. But if you don't recognize the name, you just don't let them into the meeting when it starts. We haven't heard yet about when we get to start in-person meetings.
But you don't actually do any ritual, or I mean, do you try it open, or you just simply?
It's a provisional form of the ritual. It's very, very truncated. There's obviously no signs or anything that would require, getting up and getting down or anything. But there is some ritual, and we've even had the Grand Master, the Sovereign Grand Inspector General, attend some of our meetings, things like that.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Just a good illustration of how all the Grand Lodges are different. Everyone sets their own policies naturally. In Virginia, we're limited to 10.
Yep.
I bring that up because today would be our February stated for Virginia Research Lodge. And as you all know, Virginia Research Lodge is the host. And I'm going to repeat myself so everybody who's new hears me. We're the host for these Zoom meetings. We started them in August because we couldn't have our regular stated. So I came up with the term of unstated meetings. And it took me a while to start making them regular again. I think it was December for our annual, but I'm having them every Saturday now, as much as I can. But we can't meet in person. And for most of y'all, you would understand that a research lodge is not a regular lodge. It's centrally located. Ours is in Richmond, where Brother Joyner is across the street for him. And it's about an hour and a half drive from me, an hour if I'm in a hurry. But we decided it was not worth everybody schlepping in from various parts of the state just to have our annual meeting. So the master decided, and all the officers agreed with him, we simply did not have elections this year. We did not have an annual. So all of the 2020 officers are in their seats till 2021. So I'm still junior deacon, which is fine with me. I'm in no hurry to advance. I'm happy doing what I'm doing. So the only reason we would be meeting was to have an annual. And if we're not going to have one until maybe May or later, it's not fair to the senior warden to cut his year short. So he's going to get a full year in December. Hopefully we're all back somewhat to normal back then so we can have our annuals. So that gave rise to these unstated. So maybe some good comes of all of this mess. And I love the fact I have brothers from all over the world who come in here for these every week. I'm seeing the same people coming back, and that's great. And we're always happy to have new people. Rob and Clint are fairly new, but they've been here 2 weeks in a row, so that's a good sign. And so I like that we have some regulars who are here pretty much every week, and that's great that we're building a group. We're building a community here in this one Zoom meeting. And people are telling me they like this better than some of the other ones they go to, so I guess I'm doing something right. I have no idea what it is, but apparently it's working, so I'm going to keep doing whatever I'm doing. But I think part of it is I make an effort to make sure everybody introduces themselves and says hello. We're small enough I can still ask everybody to say who they are and introduce themselves. Obviously, if we get much bigger, I've been to some where they have 100 people. obviously you can't introduce everyone, so they don't even try. So, all right. Well, it's 11 after, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, and we'll get to his program. Brother Jason Hicks, I will ask to introduce himself so I don't get his titles wrong. He will be giving a talk on the brother Sam Houston and his Masonic and world background and history. So take it away, Brother Hicks. Please introduce yourself, and you may start with your paper.
Okay, so good morning. As Chris said, my name is Jason Hicks. I am a past master of Cookeville Lodge number 266 in Cookeville, Tennessee. And as of last summer, my wife and I relocated to Greensboro, North Carolina. So I'm a member of Gate City 694 here in Greensboro. I am the current master of the Tennessee Lodge of Research. We haven't experimented with any Zoom, but hopefully in the near future we will start some offerings by Zoom. I think this is a great way for folks to connect, especially during COVID, but hopefully after COVID as well. So this talk is on Sam Houston. It's also a talk on Sam Houston's relationship with Andrew Jackson, who was also a Mason and a Grand Master of Tennessee. So Sam Houston was born March 2nd, 1793 in the Shenandoah Valley near Lexington, Virginia. He was of Scotch-Irish descent, as was Davy Crockett and President Andrew Jackson, one of the many things that they shared. His father passed away when he was young, after which the family migrated to Maryville, Tennessee. At age 16, he left the family. He didn't like working on the family farm and didn't like working in the family store run by his brother. So he found his way to a Cherokee tribe, took up residence with them, and was given a Cherokee name and accepted among them. And his Cherokee name meant the Raven, which was a nickname that followed him the rest of his life. He learned to speak fluent Cherokee, and at the age of 19, he returned to Maryville and opened a one-room schoolhouse in Knox County, which is Knoxville, right beside Blount County, where Maryville is. And it was the first school built in Tennessee. So later the same year, after growing, the particular book said bored with being a school teacher, he reported for duty with the 39th Infantry Regiment in Knoxville, Tennessee, to fight in the War of 1812. While fighting at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he was wounded by a Cherokee Indian arrow, and he also injured his shoulder and arm in battle. They didn't believe he was going to make it. Ultimately, he did, and he proved to distinguish himself in battle with General Jackson, who was the commanding general there. During the War of 1812, they developed a relationship. Part of the thing that bonded them is both of them had lost fathers at a young age. And some authors have described the Houston and Jackson's relationship as almost a father-son relationship. Jackson appointed him sub-agent managing the business of Jackson's removal of the Cherokee from East Tennessee. During that assignment, he and Secretary of War John C. Calhoun had a disagreement that ultimately made them lifelong enemies. Secretary Calhoun took issue with Houston showing up to a meeting dressed as a Cherokee Indian. And later, an inquiry was opened into Houston's distribution of supplies to the Native Americans, and he left the Army in 1818. Later on that year, he began the study of law in Lebanon, Tennessee, and ultimately passed the bar. He was appointed district attorney general in Nashville, a position that had been previously held by Andrew Jackson as well. And he was named an adjunct general of the Tennessee militia. In 1822, He stood for election to the U.S. House of Representatives, which he used as a way to support his mentor's bid for the presidency. And he served from 1823 to 1827 in the U.S. House of Representatives. He declined re-election at that point and ran for governor of Tennessee against Newton Cannon and former governor Willie Blunt. He won. And after one term, or during his term, he married a lady named Eliza Allen from Sumner County, Tennessee, whose father was a wealthy planter. In the same month, he announced his bid for re-election. After 11 weeks of marriage, she left him and rebuffed his attempts for reconciliation. According to some sources, she claimed publicly that he had sustained the, quote, dreadful injury of emasculation during the War of 1812. He resigned his governorship and boarded a steamer in the middle of the night and left for Arkansas to live with the Cherokees. He left what some considered to be a budding national political career to go live amongst the Cherokees and not run for re-election. But living amongst the Cherokees was a common thread in Houston's life, leaving a situation and living amongst the Indians. He did it in his childhood to get away from working in his brother's store, and he did it after he resigned the governorship. In 1829, he was adopted into the Cherokee tribe. He married a woman named Tiana Rogers, who was the sister of his friend John Jolly, Chief John Jolly, whom he'd befriended during his time with the Cherokee in Tennessee. He had one child with her, and during this time, he ran a trading post near Fort Gibson, Arkansas. It's also important to note here that he never actually divorced his previous wife, which will come up later in the story here. Due to abandoning his governorship and his marriage, he and Jackson suffered a rift in their friendship. He was very much a protege of Jackson, and so this did not sit well. Houston was always loyal to Jackson and his policies when he's in Washington, D.C. And in the Cherokee actually had Houston work with the Jackson administration and negotiate on their behalf because of his relationship. And in April 1932, there was a hearing on frauds of government agents committed against the Cherokees, and he encountered Congressman William Stanberry, who was from Ohio, who had made a speech attacking the administration's policies in Houston, and he accused Houston of committing frauds against the Indians as governor of Tennessee. So he proceeded to beat Stanberry, who in turn pulled a gun out and tried to shoot him, but it misfired. Afterwards, Houston continued to the theater that he was going to attend a play, and Stanberry stumbled back to his boarding house. Congress charged Houston with contempt, and he was defended by Francis Scott Key. Yes, that would be the same Francis Scott Key who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. He was found guilty, but his reprimand was not being censured, and this was only because he had friends in high places, among those James K. Polk, who was also a Tennessean and Jackson protege, and ultimately later president. Congressman Stanberry sued Houston in civil court and was awarded a $500 judgment for damages. Houston never paid the $500 judgment, and ultimately later fled to Texas, which was its own separate, which was part of Mexico then at that point. And Mexico at that point was recruiting folks to move to Texas. So Houston decided to move to Texas at that point. He had to be baptized into the Catholic faith to be able to own land at that point. Once he was baptized into the Catholic faith, he was given a land grant, as it was called at that point, Tejas. As soon as he arrives, he gets involved in political affairs. He attends the convention of 1833, A consultation of 1835, he signs the Texas Declaration of Independence and is made the commander-in-chief of Texas. So more than a month after the tragedy at the Alamo, Sam Houston's men surprise General Santa Anna's army with an attack while they were on siesta. The Battle of San Jacinto only lasted 18 minutes, and it resulted in General Santa Anna signing the Treaty of Velasco. Much has been written that Santa Anna was spared because he was a Mason, and then that he had made the Master Mason sign of distress and gave Houston the Masonic handshake. And although it's probably more attributed to a previous correspondence from President Jackson asking Houston to take mercy on him, while he is in your power, the difficulties of your enemy in raising another army will be great. Let not his blood be shed unless imperious necessity demands it. Both wisdom and humanity enjoins the course in relation to Santa Anna is what Jackson had sent Houston. However, there is some literature out there that suggests that there was more of a Masonic overture made by Santa Anna to Houston. Houston later is twice elected the president of the Republic of Texas. During his first term, there were 2 invasions of Texas by Mexico that he was able to successfully fight off. In December of 1837, Houston presides over a convention which forms the Grand Lodge of Texas. He was originally a Masonic member of Cumberland Lodge number 8 in Nashville, Tennessee, which also counted President Andrew Jackson as a member. Later, he became a member of Holland Lodge number 1 in the city of his namesake, Houston, Texas. And in between his presidential terms of Texas, Republic of Texas, he was a member of the United States House of Representatives, since the Constitution did not allow consecutive terms as president of Houston. After his second term as president, the United States of America annexed Texas, and he was one of the 2 inaugural senators elected by the Texas legislature. After annexation and his election to the United States Senate, he and his wife and son had gotten word that President Jackson was declining in health, and so they headed for Nashville on their way to Washington, D.C. They were late and missed Jackson's death by 3 hours. One scholar points out that the wallpaper in the Hermitage, which is Jackson's house in Nashville, and in the entrance hall is Tanaka searching for his father Odysseus, which is quite symbolic for their relationship. Houston held his son, Sam Jr., in his arms and said, "My son, try to remember that you've looked upon the face of Andrew Jackson." Although they did have differences through the years, they still remained very close. While serving in the United States Senate, Houston fought against sectionalism of the country and stated that I see my beloved South go down in unequal contest in a sea of blood and smoking ruin. He ran twice for governor and won the second time. He served until Texas voted to join the Confederacy, and he refused to take the oath of loyalty to the Confederacy and was evicted from office. He turned down President Lincoln's offer of 50,000 troops to prevent Texas's secession from the Union. He was later baptized in the Independent Baptist Church by Brother George Washington Baines, who was the great-grandfather of President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who told him being baptized would wash his sins away. And Houston said, "I hope so, but if they're all washed away, Lord help the fish down below." After his public service, he retired to Huntsville, Tennessee, because the hills reminded him of his boyhood home in Tennessee. He was active in the Masonic Lodge and joined Forest Lodge number 19. He died on July 26, 1863. The inscription on his grave is as follows: a brave soldier, a fearless statesman, a great orator, a pure patriot, a faithful friend, a loyal citizen, a devoted husband and father, and conscious Christian, an honest man. And that is Brother Sam Houston.
Thank you, Brother Hicks. I appreciate it. That was very interesting. When was Houston, the city, actually named after Sam Houston, and what was its name before that? Because it sounds like it was named before he died.
Yeah, it was named before he died. It was named, so he was a hero from the war. Let's see if I have it here. I think I've got it. It was after, it was the war around Texas's independence from Mexico. And so Texas Revolution. And so I believe they named it for him after that. That's the first reference in the materials that I've seen is after the war for the Texas Revolution.
Okay. And so it was a city then before, or did they start a new city and call it Houston? That's what I was trying to figure out. Like, was it called, Bluffs Peak or something?
My guess is, and this is purely conjecture, is once they had independence, they probably renamed all of the cities from their previous Mexican names.
Ah, okay.
Two names. And so, Stephen F. Austin, Houston, Texas. I think a lot of the names of some of the early major cities became named after folks who were real involved in the independence movement.
Right. Okay. So it was an established city. Okay. Interesting.
Other questions?
As a Mason, then, was he ever, say, master of a lodge or anything beyond that, or was it just simply a member in more than one lodge?
It from everything I've read, nobody ever mentions him as anything other than just a member.
Okay.
It says he was involved, but I've never read any reference that had him more than just a member.
Very good. It's interesting because some Masons are known for being prominent within Masonry and then within the profane world. Harry S. Truman was Grand Master of Missouri. Yeah, Grand Master of Missouri while he was president. So, and then of course, a lot of people, of course, there were a lot of assumptions and a lot of myths. George Washington was never a Grand Master. He was actually master of a lodge once, briefly, but he was never, he wasn't active at all because he was busy fighting the war. And he was actually approached. One of the papers we have from Virginia Research is about George Washington being approached to be master, to be Grand Master of the new forming Grand Lodge, and reasons why he wouldn't have accepted. And the position of the paper is he was never directly asked, but his name had come up more than once, but they never actually came to him and said, hey, we want you to be our Grand Master. But a lot of people mistakenly assumed, of course, George Washington was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Virginia. He had to be. It's like, well, no, he wasn't that active a Mason. I mean, you set aside his entire storied, his history in the real world. If you look at him just as being a member, it's like, yeah, we have this George guy. He pays his dues, but he doesn't come to lodge that often. I don't.
Well, that's like Andrew Jackson as Grand Master of Tennessee. One of the papers I'm eventually going to work on is going back and looking at his service as Grand Master. But back then they met quarterly. But this is in amongst him being district attorney in Nashville and Congress and the U.S. Senate, and a Tennessee Supreme Court justice. You know, so you know, being Grandmaster looked very different back then than what it looks like today. You know, you didn't have a Grandmaster driving, you know, halfway across the state and hitting up 5 different events in a day like you have now. You know, being Grandmaster was very, very different then. But that's one paper that I'm actually, it's in the hopper to be worked on.
Yes.
But unfortunately, that's a pretty deep hopper.
Right. Well, I want to say I do appreciate you giving a talk today. Clearly, you have practice at giving papers, and it shows. We had a brother out here who gave his, I think it was his first research paper, and I was pleased to give him a chance to kind of work out the kinks. But it was kind of clear he was new to speaking in public. Now, I always promote the not only masonry but also DMLA for young men. You learn to speak in public, and it's a necessary skill. And of course, nowadays with Zoom meetings and what all, everybody has to be in a meeting. You have to actually talk. But it's a necessary skill to speak in public. And I've noticed there's a difference between memorizing ritual and performing ritual, and you're basically part of a play, and you can learn your part. And all you have to remember is, okay, right after Rob says this, then I say my part. And that's all people remember, you know. That's a skill. And then getting up and speaking either from a paper or extemporaneously, like I do, is a different skill. And I'm fortunate to be proficient in both. I love doing ritual work, but I love just getting up and talking, you know, giving them a speech on a paper. But it takes some practice to do that. And it really does. And it's very useful, a skill to have. You can apply in regular life, but it takes a bit of practice to do. And
well,
so,
I will say, in my day job, I do a lot of public speaking because I'm an attorney.
Okay. Oh, well, I knew there was something I didn't like about you.
But I will give a plug to the Tennessee Lodge of Research while I'm here at another Lodge of
Please.
Research.
Yes.
Which is, you know, we welcome out-of-state members. We have a website that has almost every paper that has ever been presented at the Lodge of Research, going back to the mid 80s when it was founded in 1985. And part of your $10 yearly dues, or $15 if you're a new member, is you get the yearly collection of papers. Generally comes out about a year afterwards, and also has publication of all the short talk bulletins that came out during the year as well.
Oh, very good. Brother Joyner had your hand up. You're in the dark there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great. I have a question. I got to Tennessee for my first time back in November. My first, I went to Greenville Lodge number 1, which I believe now is the oldest lodge in Tennessee surviving. Just a quick question. I was asking about Andrew Jackson there, and they said that, you know, he was, when they were a provisional lodge, he sat in the chair of junior warden then. But there is a little, they said there was a bit of controversy over where Andrew Jackson was actually initiated. What was, you know, where he was actually initiated, passed, and raised. Can you have you had any thoughts on that, Worshipful Hicks?
So I have heard, I've read about that controversy. I haven't studied it, and I really don't have an opinion on it. There are, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the old records with some of these lodges are, if they exist, they're incomplete at best. And so unfortunately, I think that goes to fuel some of these controversies sometimes. You know, my lodge goes back to the 1850s, but we lost a lot of our early records in a house fire because for some reason our secretary at the time stored some of the records in his attic at his house. And, you know, unfortunately, I've heard more and more of those stories through the years, especially with really old lodges, is that, you know, their records were destroyed at different points. And, you know, unfortunately, I think that goes to cause issues because we can't give answers that are definitive, just like that.
I was going to say, we're speaking about research and all that. I don't know how many of them our brothers here have given research papers or are thinking about writing research papers and getting in on this. And I would strongly recommend you do it. Obviously, we want to further Masonic education as much as possible. But something that Brother Hicks said, I wanted to draw attention to. Every time I write a paper, I come across something and I have to make a note. That would be a good paper in and of itself, and remind myself to circle back and research that more. The more you get into this, the more you find yourself saying, oh yeah, I could go write a paper on that. Oh, that would be interesting in and of itself. So you're always finding something new to write about. So once you get in the business of writing research papers, you're always going to have more and more material and more subjects that are worth delving into. And writing a research paper is a reward in and of itself. I mean, it's wonderful to go to a lodge and then hear someone give a talk and you learn more about Masonry and how it ties into history and how it relates to our everyday lives. And all of that is great, but the rewards to yourself in writing the paper are almost as great because you're learning all of this stuff. And you have to condense all of this that you read into a 15, 20-minute talk, but there's more material out there, believe me. You have to usually whittle it down so it's not half an hour or more. So you've always learned more than you share. And then you begin to see the connections between things. You see the similarities and how patterns repeat themselves. So like I gave this last year, I had the Lodge of the Day that I started for Virginia lodges, which was a lot of fun for me. But every single day I posted in our group, starting with Norfolk #1 and going all the way through numerically, and just gave a useful fact about every lodge. And every lodge in the state has its own story, and everyone has something interesting that I can share that lodge went through. And that's why I'm always interested in names and where the names come from for lodges, what they're named for. And they all have just their own unique little history going on. But I got much more out of it than the people people who read them, and everybody was commenting. That's it's really great. I'm enjoying it. I look forward to reading this every day. But I'm telling you, I got more out of it just doing the research myself, just stretching my brain and learning more about all of this history. It gives you a whole different perspective on things. Just seeing all of these lodges, some of them hundreds of years old, you're surprised how many of them fell to fires. Either the lodge building burned down or the lodge records were lost through the fires. But when you think about it, we didn't really have good fire codes until the 50s and the 60s in this last century. You had buildings that were built of wood, because that's the most readily available material. There may be brick involved, but for the most part, they were wood. And you didn't have sprinklers. You didn't have fire extinguishers. You had kerosene stoves. You had oil lamps. You had all sorts of open flames in a big old tinderbox. Yeah, believe it or not, we actually had a lot of fires. It's just hard to relate to today where we live in these modern buildings that are designed to avoid fires. But back then, yeah, pretty much any building you lived in or went to church in or school in or worked in or held lodge in, every one of them was a fire trap. So it's not surprising how many of them had fires over the years. And then everything was lost before the fire could be put out. So it's unfortunate, but it's a pretty common thread, how many lodges were lost to fires.
Well, and Chris, another thing that I thought of as you were talking was one of the easiest, most approachable ways to start in Masonic research is find out if there's been a lodge history of your lodge written.
Yes.
If not, be the one that writes your lodge's history. You're right there near your lodge. You're right there near the lodge minutes. You're right there near folks who can, give you an oral history that you can then put down into a written history.
Absolutely. Very
That
good.
is a incredibly approachable first start
Yes.
that is hugely important. You know, all the time when I was first in masonry, I'd always ask to be given a talk to the newly initiated EAs. And it was just kind of a basic explanatory talk, tell them things they could do and couldn't do as EAs, and kind of explain what they were going to go through. And I added to it, and I pointed to some of the paintings on the wall in our lodge room of folks who had been grand masters, folks who had been grand high priest, folks who had been grand commanders. And I tried to give them some of that history. Because otherwise it was just a picture of some guy that was old and dead
Right.
on the wall. They didn't understand what the connection was. And, so I think the easiest way to start is just by giving just by working on a simple lodge history. It doesn't have to be 100 pages. It doesn't have to be 20 pages. It can be 5 pages, 10 pages. It's kind of what you make of it. In the Tennessee Lodge of Research, we're going to publish an ebook this year of all the accumulated lodge histories that we have. We're actually working on we published a book about 15 years ago of the best, most unique papers over the first 20 years. And I am putting the finishing touches on our book of the last 10 years, which hopefully both should be available as ebooks within the next month. But that's I'm giving a talk 2 weeks at the Tennessee Lodge of Research on a Mason who really there's not been much written on him. It's a guy named J. Ray Shute. You never heard of him, but have you ever heard of Allied Masonic degrees?
Indeed.
Have you ever heard of Night Masons?
Yep.
Blue Friars? Basically, any organization that meets during Masonic Week in Washington, D.C., J. Ray Shute was a part of. He was part of a group called the Innovators in the 30s that basically had a whole lot of free time because the Depression was going on. And they traveled the world and did tons of research to work out what was legitimate Masonic organizations and illegitimate Masonic organizations. And they brought them from Europe to the United States. And so I've put together a paper on him, and I'm doing a talk next week at or 2 weeks at the Tennessee Lodge of Research about him. But there is a whole lot of folks who have done great things Masonically, who people just think, oh, everybody knows about him.
Right. And they don't.
Yeah. But
I want to get Brother Junior, who's had his hand up. Please, Brother Junior, go ahead.
Let me unmute myself again. Excuse me.
Yes, please.
Just a couple of things. I agree with you guys because, as you know, a lot of lodges, particularly in the South, lost records during the war because the lodges, they're destroyed, they got looted. There's a lot of stories, and then sometimes they were scattered. But for example, because I'm tour guide of our building in Richmond, which goes back to 1785. And we're right around the corner of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum. So people were always asking me about John Allen. And I even read some books on Poe. Then a couple of them said that Allen was a Mason, and it didn't sound right to me because everything I'd read about Allen said that he was either an agnostic at best or an atheist, most likely. So I said, well, let's get to the bottom of this. I wrote to the Grand Lodge of Virginia. And one of the reasons I want to know, because at one time there were like 4 blue lodges meeting in Mason's Hall. So they looked at the time frame. There's absolutely no record in any of the lodges meeting in Richmond that John Allen was a member. So now I feel that with authority, I can say on our tours that Allen was definitely not a member and wasn't likely to have been a member. Secondly, just another interesting point on that, because we're on the haunted tours, when they come by our building. So we come out of meetings all the time. The haunted tours are out there. And they started telling us recently that, oh, the way we heard that someone was shot and died on the steps. And we started researching that because nobody in our records knew of anybody being killed on the front steps of the lodge, even during the Civil War. And it turns out that someone was killed when the Grand Lodge moved to Broad Street in 1900, and that somebody got killed there. And now the story was, they said, oh, somebody was killed on the Grand Lodge steps, but it was the other location of the Grand Lodge. So it is interesting, just how little things will lead you from one thing to the other and really enlighten everything. So just a few pointers there.
Thank you, Brother Jordan. Absolutely. And I lost the train of thought I was going to share. That's all right. Oh, yeah. Thomas Jefferson, people assume that he was a Mason. And I've read one of our papers that goes into great detail, like Brother Junior alludes to, of people did research into it and no, there is no evidence that Thomas Jefferson was ever a Mason. And I kind of knew even before I saw that paper, in my mind, it was clear because Washington was a Mason. Many of our early founding fathers were Masons. But, okay, Fredericksburg Lodge, and I'll mention them, since Brother Tripp is on here, I've attended their lodge. They keep George Washington's Masonic Bible in a nice glass case, and they bring it out for special occasions. If a president of the United States was a member of your lodge or was raised in your lodge, you'd be bragging about it endlessly. And no lodge has ever come forward and said, yes, Tom Jefferson was a member of our lodge. You would think they would know. It's not some minor fact like this Mr. Allen that, he's not that famous. If you had a president who was a member of your lodge, you admit it's kind of like being a vegan or being into CrossFit. You're going to make sure everybody around you knows that Thomas Jefferson is a member of your lodge, and you'd be able to prove it. So that in and of itself told me early on he wasn't. He may have been aware of Masonry. He may have had similar ideas to Masonry. As one who was steeped in the Reformation and the Protestant Enlightenment of Europe that influenced Masonry and that came across, those principles came across through Masonry into this country and was an essential core of what we built this country on and what are called Masonic principles, but they can be traced back to earlier principles in Europe. But Thomas Jefferson was certainly well aware that Masons existed, and he knew several, and he may have been certainly sympathetic, but there is no evidence that he was a Mason, and we can say pretty definitively at this point he certainly was not. But again, it's one of those things. You see things published, pictures of Masonic presidents, and they include a lot of people in it. People who don't know better say, well, every Mason, every president was a Mason. It's a requirement and all. And, Trump is a Mason, and Obama was a Mason, and Clinton and the Bushes. Nope, none of them. Nope. Got to go all the way back to Brother Gerald Ford. That's it. Nobody since then. Sorry. So it's just one of those common things. It's understandable. People who don't know better assume. But yeah, clearly Thomas Jefferson was not a Mason, or somebody would have been bragging about it long before now.
Definitely.
Brother Christopher, not even a chance of saying maybe his lodge fell into the dark at some point many years ago.
Well, but the lodges he would have been a member, because the lodges that existed where he lived when he would have been have checked their records, and they're certain he did not.
Okay.
Because back then, pretty much if you lived in a town, say Charlottesville, you would join a lodge where you lived, either where you worked or where you lived. So it would have not have been, it's unlikely he would have joined some lodge in Pennsylvania or something and then, not been active wherever he lived. So yeah, but you're right. There are a lot of lodges that disappeared. One of my upcoming projects is to go and research all of the lodges in Virginia, because we have quite a few that went away. I did a history of the 290. It goes up to number 329, not counting ours. We have a numbering system in Virginia. Most Grand Lodges do. Of course, the Brits do not. But, the Brits do, I'm sorry. Massachusetts does not. and Hawaii does not. But most Grand Lodges do number their lodges. And we have 1 through 329 is the highest number. I think the high water mark was like 348. So basically, the next lodge along gets the next number. And then if a lodge folds, especially if it's a very low number, that number gets reassigned to a new lodge. So you have lodges that are 100 years or more younger than their neighbor, and their number is like 100 points less. Because having a low lodge number is apparently a big deal to some. But then we have some like Virginia Research, which is 1777. There were lodges that were named for dates. So we got about 10 numbers in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, 1900s even, that were named based on the year, a specific year in Masonic history. One lodge was named for the year they were founded for some reason. And then all the other ones simply went up in number from 1 up to 300 something. And then as the lodges were closed, they filled in those numbers with younger numbers. Well, something I was wondering about is like, well, why were there so many that folded? And then I came to learn that when West Virginia broke off from Virginia during the Civil War, they formed their own Grand Lodge. There were around 100 lodges in Virginia. They were part of the Grand Lodge of Virginia, located in that part of the state, those 13 or so counties that broke off from us. All of those lodges were renamed and renumbered under the Grand Lodge of West Virginia, freeing up all of those numbers to get reassigned to Virginia lodges that came around after 1865, which explains why there's such a large number that were able to be renumbered, which is a lower number. So I want to go back and catalog all of the lodges that Virginia ever had, just get the numbers year to year and give a little recognition to every single one of them, not just the ones that still exist today, the just under 300 we still have today, because I'd be willing to bet there were over 500 lodges in Virginia, maybe 600, over the course of the last 250 years.
It's actually interesting, Chris, because in Tennessee, when a lodge goes extinct, the number does not get recycled.
Right.
That lodge number dies with that lodge. It was only in the last, I think, 2 years ago, they allowed an extinct number to be used on a lodge, and there was a lot of consternation and controversy around that vote at Grand Lodge. But it was the current Deputy Grand Master's home lodge, and so that kind of greased the skids for that vote a little bit more.
That's interesting. I can see the reason either way, but for some reason people, as a side note, we have an issue in parts of Virginia, particularly here in Norfolk, but other places where there are too many lodges in an area to support the current membership. And I mean, every Grand Lodge out there, I'm confident to say, every one of you has gone down in membership since World War II, because that's when a whole lot of Mason came in. And that's when they, they came in then, and they're all, like Brian Smith's age, old. Just kidding. No, they're all of the brothers that came in the 40s, they start dying, obviously, by like, the 80s and the 90s. So membership has gone down simply due to demographics. It has nothing to do with anything you're doing wrong. It's just simply people are getting old and they die. So in an area like Norfolk, which has currently 10 blue lodges, and we were at 13 at one point, lodges don't want to merge. Lodges don't want to, the members don't want to face facts and say, hey, look, we have,
they don't want to consolidate.
They don't, they don't want to lose their uniqueness. And I have a really low number in my lodge. We don't want to go away and lose that number. But then you end up with lodges that are stagnant. They have 5 or 6 active members. They're recycling junior deacons. And it's just a fortunate thing. Brother Dave, I see you had your hand up. And I think Clinton Rob had their hand up too, I think. But Brother Dave, go ahead, please, before I ramble on more. Brother David, Brother Denbor, I can't say your last name. Brother David. You're on mute. Okay, we'll come back. Brother Clint, you had something to say?
Yeah, Williamsburg, is that still active there in Virginia?
Number 6, yes. They're not likely to go away.
Okay, I was just wondering because when I was stationed at Fort Eustis there, my mom and I were walking around, and she was an Eastern Star, so she saw the lodge for Eastern Star too for the chapters.
Oh, wow. Yes.
And I was just wondering about that because I wasn't a Mason at that time, but got me kind of more interested into it because of the histories of everything.
Williamsburg number 6 is one of the charter lodges of Virginia. They received their charter from either Scotland or England, I forget which. All of the lodges in Virginia that were here when we started our Grand Lodge were from England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. The French lodges did not participate when we chartered the Grand Lodge. Williamsburg was, I believe, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, but they were one of the original signers, the ones who came together to form the Grand Lodge. There were 9 lodges that came together. Norfolk number 1 in my district was one of them as well. And I don't think any of those will give up their charter if they can help it. Williamsburg is a very, very, very long and storied history. And because they're in colonial Williamsburg and they have ties to that, they have a huge reason to stick around. They also have a research lodge too that meets in Williamsburg.
Wow.
A couple times.
I didn't know that.
And they focus mostly on colonialism, Williamsburg history, and what all. But yeah, I know a few members of that.
Hopefully one of these years I'd make it back over there.
Oh yeah. It's neat. They have a chair. They have a chair with a very long history that I forget who I think it was our first Grand Master who owned it and donated to the lodge. They have a door, one of the oldest doors in Masonic history. They make a big deal about their door,
boy,
but it's that old. And
yeah.
Even though they've renovated the lodge.
Right. Well, I would be proud of that. I would definitely be proud of that.
All right.
Brother
Jose, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Another question going back to Houston. So when you did your research on Houston and you naturally ended up bumping into other contemporary Masons like Jackson and Austin and whatnot, out of curiosity, since that was also at the same period as the Morgan Affair and the rise of the big anti-Masonic movement, just curious if you bumped into anything in your studies, about like the impact of that on Houston, Austin, Jackson, on Masonry in the frontier at that time.
So the anti-Masonic stuff that I have found largely centers on Jackson, as he was kind of the focal point of it, but because it became an issue in the presidential campaign. I haven't seen anything on Houston. It's actually funny. So I'll give you all a little bit of background. So in 2013, the Grand Lodge of Tennessee celebrated its bicentennial. And so the Houston paper was originally developed for a talk at the Hermitage. Tennessee Masonry has had 5 heads of state. So Jackson, Houston, Johnson, Polk, and there's somebody I'm forgetting who's a chief of the Cherokee Nation. And so that's how it originally developed. And then I did a talk at a Yorkright college dinner on all 5 of them. But Houston, I was always particularly drawn to because I spent 5 years as a kid living outside of Houston. And so when you grow up in Texas, they pound Texas history into you pretty heavily. And so I'd read a lot about Houston. And then when I found out he was originally from Tennessee, that kind of tied everything together a little bit more. But Jackson's the only real one that I've ever read any real effect of the anti-Masonry movement. And it really became a campaign issue in his presidential race. But I haven't seen anything about any of the others that really have any effect. And of course, that movement died out pretty spectacularly after that. And, we went back to electing Masonic presidents. After that, the movement survived. So.
Thank you. Brother David, you had your hand up earlier.
I was going to ask about military lodges in Petersburg, like Fort Lee. Are they chartered by the Grand Lodge of Virginia, or are some of them with the Prince Hall Lodge?
What was the one you mentioned?
Fort Lee, like Petersburg in Virginia.
Yeah.
I was stationed there and knew people that were Master Masons, but I had no idea if they're Prince Halls, clandestine, because it was all in the military.
I'm pretty sure. Well, Petersburg Lodge is in the Grand Lodge of Virginia. I would think if it was a military lodge, I mean, there was a time when we had a lot of military lodges. We don't have that many anymore. There was an effort to actually push all the Masonic lodges off of the military bases because of the whole issue with Prince Hall and people who didn't know better claiming it was discriminatory and on and on. But yeah, I'm pretty sure Petersburg is a Virginia lodge. So if there was a lodge chartered, even though if it's on a military base, even though that's federal government property, it would have to be chartered with the Grand Lodge of the state that you're in, such as Virginia. We don't have a nationwide Grand Lodge, obviously. The Brits had a lot of military lodges that traveled with the unit. Because, I mean, obviously back then, nowadays, of course, if we want to send, 10,000 troops to some far corner of the world, we just load them up on planes, and we load them up on boats, and we send them there, and then they come back again. Whereas during Revolutionary War times and up until whenever mass transit became more of a capability, you had military units that simply traveled. You lived on the road. You sent military units from the British came over here, and they basically stayed here for years and just camped and simply moved where they needed to move. So at that time, you would have Masons in a military unit would charter a military lodge under the Grand Lodge of England and have a military charter that would basically say you don't have a permanent home. Because nowadays, if my lodge got a charter, you have a permanent address. You have to have a fixed location where you meet. And a military lodge was special in that it could move about wherever the military unit was sent. That's where they could hold lodge. But I'm sure that idea died out, probably over 100 years ago. If anybody wants a paper to write, there you go. Military charters. I really don't think there were American military lodges specifically chartered as belonging to a military unit, as opposed to a lodge that met on a given base. And we have a number of those, but they weren't tied to the base. It's just that's where they met. They were allowed to meet on base property, but they weren't tied to a specific unit that was in transit. So,
Yep.
If that answers your question.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Like, are Prince Halls clandestine, or do you recognize them for business, or is that like a blackball? I know in Florida, I got blackballed for that, like doing business with Prince Halls.
Wait, what? I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I was just wondering, Virginia, like, because when I was stationed there, like a lot of like members, there were also Masons mentioned, be careful which Mason you talk to. And I wasn't sure if I get blackballed or
Okay. Yeah, let's clarify. Well, okay, you say do business, so I want to make sure we're clear here. Okay. Speaking specifically Masonically, nothing to do with, when you say do business with that, I read that as something different, like, shop at their store or whatever. We're not talking about that. Strictly talking about Masonically and attending a lodge. And this is a very, very long subject, and I'll try and summarize. The lodge you belong to is part of a Grand Lodge. Once you're a Master Mason, you can go visit any lodge within your state because that's all part of the same Grand Lodge. If you were to say travel to Virginia and the Grand Lodge of Texas and the Grand Lodge of Virginia recognize each other, you could attend a lodge with me because our Grand Lodges recognize each other. If the Grand Lodge of Texas recognizes the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas, which I think they do, you can also visit a Prince Hall lodge because the two Grand Lodges recognize each other. Does that make sense?
It does. I appreciate it.
Now, that doesn't mean that, just like here, if we had a brother here who was Prince Hall, and Brother Ade is not, I'm sorry, he's not. I assumed he was, but he wasn't. He's Canadian, and they don't have Prince Hall up there. And he's also from, what is it? What country? You're on mute, Brother Ade. Where were you raised again?
There's Prince Hall in Canada.
There is. Okay.
Yes, there is, but I've never been to one.
Right. And you're from, I'm sorry, what, where were you
So
raised?
my mother-in-law is under UGLE.
Right. But what country? It's in.
It's a district in Ghana.
Ghana, that's it. I'm sorry. I didn't want to say the wrong one. Yes, Ghana. Okay. Because I have ties to Gabon. I was in Fredericksburg when the lodge from Gabon, our sister lodge, their sister lodge visited. I think I mentioned that. In fact, Brother Tripp could probably give us more info on that. But yeah, so Prince Hall is primarily an American thing. But it's hypothetically, say Brother Clint and Brother Rob over here were Prince Hall, which they're not, I doubt. You can talk to them here the same way you could talk to anybody who's not a Mason, right? It doesn't matter. You can speak to someone who is from a lodge that you are not sure whether or not your Grand Lodge recognizes them. And as long as you talk to them about things you could talk to about a non-Mason, then you're fine. What you can't do is give them the grips and talk about the passwords and talk about anything secret in Masonry, just the same way you couldn't talk to someone who wasn't a Mason. But it's very simple. Just look at it as, if I'm not in lodge, if I'm in lodge and I can only say it there, but I can't say it out here, then just don't say that to anyone on the street. You're never gonna hear any discussion in this Zoom meeting or online that is anything that is secret. So anything that you can, basically any of the passwords, anything as specifics about the ritual, anything about the signs, the grips, anything like that, you just don't mention that. But you can talk about Masonry in general with anyone and you won't be in trouble. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
I'm happy to clear that up. And I run into this all the time. I was talking earlier about I'm on several groups that deal with the clandestine lodges, and then primarily Prince Hall brothers running those. And I keep pointing this out over and over and over again. If you meet someone on the street and they say they're a Mason, you can say hello. You can recognize the ring. You can say, you know, what lodge do you belong to? And you talk to them as you would talk to anyone who is not a Mason, unless you intend to bring them to your lodge and they're going to attend a tiled meeting. At that point, they're going to be vetted and they're going to have to show their dues card, and they're going to have to show, there's 4 steps to attend a lodge that you're not a member of. You have to have a dues card or something proving you're a Mason. You have to show some ritual signs. You have to take an oath, and they have to look it up in a book and verify that your lodge is one recognized by our Grand Lodge. That's it. And the only time you have to prove you're a Mason is if you're going to sit in lodge with someone. Any other circumstance, anywhere in the world, here in this meeting, me bumping into you into the street, me working with you at our job, any other circumstance, you do not have to prove someone is a Mason to talk to them. You just talk to them about stuff that's not secret. It's that simple. And I hear about all this nonsense, and I'm sorry, it's basically a Prince Hall thing, unless it's a clandestine thing of you guarding your light and challenging people. And somehow some brothers get the wrong idea, and they think it's their business. If I see you wearing a ball cap that's got a square and compass on it, I have the obligation to come over there to confront you, to demand that you prove that you're a Mason to me right there in the street. And that's nonsense. And that's not the word I want to use. It starts with B and ends in it. That's nonsense, brothers. We do not validate Masonry on the block. We don't validate it in a room like this. The only time you have to actually prove you are a regular Mason is if you're getting ready to walk into a regular tiled lodge meeting. and nowhere else. And anybody who thinks otherwise is sadly misinformed. And it irritates the heck out of me to imagine people are Brother David is a good example. He's only a fellow craft. He doesn't know everything about masonry yet. And if he happened to be wearing a ball cap or something and he got confronted on the street by someone demanding he prove himself, he wouldn't know what is going on. So it's really an unfortunate tradition that's out there. And it rubs me the wrong way because it's not what masonry is about. We have no reason to be challenging each other. And it irks me. That's why I went on a soapbox here. So yeah, feel free to talk about masonry. Anything you see here, these rooms are a perfect example of what you can talk about publicly in masonry. Because I'm very careful about what papers I publish online, because there's a few I've had to reject. They were presented in my lodge and they're written down, but I have to look at them and say, nope, that gets too close to revealing stuff and I won't publish it. And some just won't be published. If I put it online, if I send it in an email, if I publish it on Facebook, or if we talk about a subject here in a Zoom meeting, I've made sure it's a topic we can talk about that's safe. And that's 95% of what you hear in masonry is stuff we can talk about. If we are looking into specific words and ritual, specific passwords, steps, signs, tokens, stuff like that, that's what we have to steer clear of. But we can say in general almost everything out about masonry. And that's something a lot of brothers don't seem to understand. They think we have to keep everything a big fat secret, and we don't. So I hope that's helpful. Okay, that's my soapbox. Sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've been on other like lodge Zoom channels, and they mention like phoenixmasonry.org, and a lot of documents are very old fashioned. Like there's definitely a lot of more racial or, sectarian kind of like terms used. Like, how do you guys translate that? Like, is that something you wouldn't put in like a research lodge? Because I've seen some lodges like they have, you can't change the documents because they're historical, but how do you like translate that to present day? What's legal and moral now?
Well, if it's and some of the stuff you're talking about may well be clandestine in the first place. It may not be regular masonry. I don't know. But for example, the Grand Lodge of Virginia I can use because I know that better than anything else. We have our Constitution, which spells out basically what a lodge is, what a Grand Lodge is, what the landmarks are. Landmarks are basically, there's about 25, I think if we totaled them all up, there'd probably be about 35, 40, but there's around 25 landmarks, ancient landmarks that every single Grand Lodge recognizes. And there's statements like, the Grand Master must be elected. Every lodge must have a master and 2 wardens. And every lodge must have a charter or warrant from some Grand Lodge, and on and on. They're simple statements. They're not secrets. So the constitutions of Virginia, and I don't think we actually elaborate the landmarks. We talk about them, but we don't write them down and say, these are the landmarks. It's sort of like everyone knows what they are. It's kind of a weird thing. The makeup of the Grand Lodge, the methodical digest, which are all of our rules, point by point, they go into great detail about how a lodge and a Grand Lodge operate. Like these are the elected positions, these are the appointed positions, and so on. All of that is public record. That's something anyone can read, and there's nothing secretive about it. And then there is parts of our ritual that are in what's called the Manual of Work, which describe in vague terms when it needs to be vague, and we can use that as a reference, but most of our secret work is actually not written down. So if you're going to learn our lectures, for example, you have to learn it from another brother, but half of it is written down, and like the lambskin, what the lambskin means, that's written down. But then stuff surrounding it isn't. So it gets kind of confusing. But basically, if your Grand Lodge publishes it, then you can talk about it. And that's kind of the way to look at it. If your Grand Lodge published something, you can talk about it openly because they say this isn't secret. But there are places in the Manual of Work where they have like 3 asterisks, where you get into something that the meaning of something is considered secret. Whereas if I say like the 3 pillars, which are in the east, west, and south, and represent wisdom, strength, and beauty. And then there's more stuff that's secret. So that's kind of that's what I use as my my yardstick is I can look at the manual of work and say, okay, I see 3 dots where I've memorized what that is. I can't talk about that specifically, but I can talk about the 3 pillars because they're written down. And that's kind of the guide you can go by. And if you don't know, ask a brother in your lodge, say, hey, can I talk about this? Is this, if it's written down, it's not secret. That said, there are Grand Lodges out there that use ciphers, which are part of the ritual. And I think there may be some Grand Lodges that actually write down the whole ritual and they issue it in a book to their members. And that's how that Grand Lodge operates. But most of the ones I deal with, it's either all secret or it's in a cipher of some kind, and we don't use ciphers. It's interesting. Brother Rob, you had your hand up? Or you just... Go ahead.
Yes. For lodges and well, for the Grand Lodges recognize another Grand Lodge, what that actually goes to, has anybody heard of the Grand Master's convocation or communication that is held once a year? And it is in...
You talk about the North American Association of Grandmasters?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where all the Grand Masters come together and they sit down, talk about the ritual, talk about everything that they do. And that's how one Grand Lodge will either say, okay,
I recognize you.
I'll recognize you, or I don't recognize you. If you do it this way, we'll recognize you in their rituals or whatever it has to be. So that's actually just a clarification of how Grand Lodges recognize one another throughout the world. Is just that right there. So I just wanted to bring that up for our fellow craft there, is that's how that somewhat works.
Then for the Canadians, some of them do come down for the York Rite Convention. They do come down and visit with us, and we have a really good time too. So that's another way we do things too.
I'm
for Montana here, we've actually have 2 historical lodges. One is Bannock 1864, which is one of the old lodges, but we also have Mullen Pass, which is the first meeting in Montana, which was actually up in the mountains, and 3 Master Masons came together and opened up a lodge on the hillside, and that is another historical lodge. And any Mason throughout that is recognized by the Grand Lodge of Montana can petition those 2 lodges. $50, you're a lifetime membership after that, and you're set and you're golden. And you can come up to Montana if you're up here, and you can go to the annual meetings once a year and participate in some good fun.
Cool.
If you just want to be...
Give me a second, Rob. Brother Hicks has to leave us. I wanted to make sure we all said thank you before he had to go, and I appreciate you.
Hey, thanks.
Perfectly in line with what we're looking to do. So thank you, Brother Hicks. We appreciate it. Hope you come back and join us again.
Definitely, and thank you guys, and I'll look forward to coming back again sometime.
Very good. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.
And I was going to say something, Brother Rob. I'll come back to you here, but I did publish a link here in the chat, and this chat will be made available on the website and then on the group page, and we'll be posting this on YouTube later. But that's a talk that I put on YouTube called Jurisdiction, Amity, and Visitation. And this is Brother David. I hope you take a look at it. It's on YouTube, so I wasn't planning to make it one of our talks. I have plenty of talks I've given that if I can't find a speaker, I'll be happy to give a talk. But I'm trying to find people other than me, since I'm hosting. I'm doing most of the blabbing here anyway. But that's one that I wrote because, as I say, I'm on a lot of Facebook groups with a lot of brothers who they don't know a lot about recognition because their lodge isn't really teaching it. And every lodge has a responsibility to teach the basics. Stuff I've covered right here. And most of the talks I've written, David, is I'm very well practiced at meeting new EAs and fellowcrafts in our lodges and explaining things to them so that they understand it. And there should be members of every lodge that do that with the new members. Tell them stuff that's not in the ritual, stuff like how visitation works. And over time, I've just started writing down all the same talks I'm giving to these brothers so that I can put it online or whatever. But I found that with recognition, most brothers don't have a clue really of how it works. So I tried to lay it all out. And as I explained, it's too long to put in a Facebook post. So I just sat down and made a video, and it's 16 minutes long. But it explains exactly how recognition works and why it came about and why it is that we have so many different Grand Lodges and why some recognize each other. Every Grand Lodge makes the choice of who they recognize. But with the North American Conference, as you mentioned, that kind of makes it more likely to recognize a newer Grand Lodge, is because they meet and all that. And I'm sure there were times when the Grand Masters tell each other, we don't like what you're doing. And that's kind of how they deal with it. But that's a fairly new organization. I don't know when it started. I think it was only started less than 100 years ago. But I would definitely recommend that YouTube video. It explains how the recognition works between Grand Lodges. So, did you have another point, Brother Rob? I had to cut you off there.
That's okay there. But as I was saying, does any of your states have historical lodges that Master Masons around can join and be a part of, or anything like that?
As far as actually joining, Virginia, if we recognize, we allow affiliations, and this is something that's interesting, that in Virginia, you can affiliate with as many lodges as you want. So just take a simple example. I belong to Charles T. Morton Lodge, which is folded. I was able to affiliate with Ocean View Lodge, where I am now. I could belong to both lodges for as long as I want. And if I was going to join and demit, which I ended up doing, I can start with Lodge A, petition Lodge B for affiliation, get voted in, and then demit from Lodge A, or stay in both. I can belong to multiple lodges. In some jurisdictions, you are not
That's
allowed
what we did.
to affiliate with another lodge, which means if I'm in, I'll say Texas, I don't know if it's true in Texas or not, but just pick on them. If I'm in Lodge A and I want to join Lodge B, I must demit from A, petition B, wait to be accepted, and only then am I a member again, which is a very perilous thing to do to somebody. In some states, I'm not saying this is Texas, but as an example, in some Grand Lodges, you are not allowed to affiliate with another lodge. You can only belong to one lodge at a time. And that literally means you have to demit before you petition a second lodge. Even if you plan to move to that lodge, you can't belong to two at the same time. It's not allowed. And that's a very weird way of looking. So
that's what we did.
In and beyond that, if you belong to it, because Virginia allows dual membership in multiple lodges, if you belong to a lodge in, say, Montana, and my Grand Lodge recognizes your Grand Lodge, you can petition to affiliate with any Virginia lodge, and if they vote you in, you're a member. But we are not blanket open to anyone, just sort of, I mean, you're literally joined as a member.
My question is Montana has 2 historical lodges that any brother from around can petition and become a member by doing a proper procedure. Does any other state have any historical lodges that are just a one-time fee and you become a member of that?
No, Virginia does not have that.
A full time.
You pay dues. You belong, you pay dues every year. Yes, we don't have
okay. So there's
sort of I just want to join and get a piece of paper saying I belong. Are you actually a member of that lodge? Can you show up and vote? Can you hold office?
Yes. Basically how these lodges go, they're historical lodges made by the Grand Lodge of Montana. And we have Canadian brothers, we have people from all over
Texas, every place you can think of. And they're lifetime members.
And what it is you pay the $50. You don't have to pay any more dues because it's a historical lodge. And once a year, we have a meeting in Bannock and a meeting at Mullen Pass. And it's just very good, interesting meetings. A lot of things go on there. But I was just seeing if there's any other states that actually have historical lodges recognized.
What I find interesting is that I just wanted to clarify that you could pay $50 and you're a life member and you would have the same rights and benefits as a regular member of that historical lodge. You get hold office, vote on petitions, be master of that lodge, and not be paying dues to that lodge.
Well,
That's
basically what it is, it's a historical lodge done by the state of Montana.
Right.
Okay, both of these lodges are done by the state of Montana. And we have an annual meeting, and in order to be an officer, you have to be a card-carrying member of that lodge.
Right.
So so we would actually have a dues card saying Bannock Lodge number 3777.
Well,
and that shows that we are a member of
Let me ask you this way. Is everyone who's a member of that lodge in the same boat? All of them paid the one-time fee, and it doesn't collect dues from
one-time fee. Yeah.
Okay, so the whole lodge is set up that way.
They don't.
I'm just saying it would not be
the
fair.
whole lodge is set up that way.
Okay, well that makes sense. If you see what I'm saying, it wouldn't be fair to you if you were a dues-paying member of that lodge, and then your dad joined under the $50 thing, and he got to be master. And you know what I'm saying? It wouldn't be fair to the regular members if you had them. No, we do not have a circumstance like that at all. That's interesting.
But what I will do is on the Facebook, I will get a link to the Bannock Historical Lodge. And if any brother that wants to join can go ahead and fill out the petition, send it off, and get your $50 and you're done, and you'll get a nice certificate, a nice dues card.
Come to lodge when you want to.
And if you're in the state of Montana traveling or something, come in and enjoy a meeting. You know,
if you want to put the link here in the chat I would say put it on the group page too.
Yeah, there's.
I need to call Brother Dave. Had his hand up. He's been patient. I do my best to make sure I call on you timely, but I don't want to cut people off. So that's my job as host. I have to be rude from time to time. I try to be as polite as possible. Brother Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. I was going to ask in Virginia and other Grand Lodges like that are here, like, do you accept disabled members, like people that have PTSD or blind or people that are in a wheelchair?
That's a long question. Okay, let me put it this way. If you are a profane, a non-Mason, and you petition a Virginia lodge, you must be, you have to have all your arms and legs and generally your fingers and toes. And the Grand Master has to make some kind of exception, because we still operate under the idea of you must be hale and whole. I forget what the exact phrase is. Basically, you have to have all your body parts to join, because we can't teach you the ritual and the signs if you can't actually make the signs. But once you're a Mason, if you get injured, you don't kick you out. I've met Masons who don't have one brother didn't have both of his arms. He only had them down to the elbows. And I saw him standing, making the signs along with everybody else at the opening, but he did what, you could tell what he was doing, but clearly he wasn't moving his arms because they weren't there, but he was at least moving like he would. So once you're a Mason, we're not going to kick you out if you're not whole, but to join, you must be whole. And that's just the way it's been. I guess you can make an argument whether that should be changed, but really, if you can't assume the position at the altar when you're initiated, and this is where we talk around something, I'm not going to get into specifics, but all of you would know what I mean. If you can't kneel at the altar, you can't take upon yourself the initiation. But once you're a Mason, if you wanted to affiliate, I don't think anyone would have any problem with it, because you're already a Mason. You've already been initiated. So, and PTSD and stuff like that really isn't even a point of discussion. It's literally missing a body part. And if I mentioned our Methodical Digest, we have rules. So you have a rule in the Methodical Digest says a man must be, fully intact in body, however it's worded. And that's the particular rule. And you can point to the paragraph that says it. And then under each rule, you have decisions, because a grandmaster in a given year has to make a ruling on something. And that ruling gets written in the Methodical Digest to say, okay, this grandmaster made a ruling about this here. For example, candidate for Lodge XYZ was not allowed to be initiated as he was missing the index finger on his right hand. I mean, literally, it gets into that kind of detail. So clearly a grandmaster had to step in and say yes or no to fulfill that rule. And I find that fascinating to go back and read through history when we do it. And by the way, in the same paragraph there, another grandmaster said, brother missing left hand, and he let him in. So it's the individual grandmaster who made a decision that year for that circumstance. And they aren't always in line with each other. So that's kind of interesting history to go through. It's like, well, I guess that grandmaster was being a stickler and that one felt more generous. I don't know. But I find that interesting. Brother Jose, you had a question?
No, I was actually going to just comment on the same question that in DC, for example, this is, without obviously speaking on behalf of my Grand Lodge or in any position of authority, my observation as a DC Mason is that does come from the ancient landmarks, that you have to be, fully physically fit. They do strictly enforce you cannot be a minor. You have to be of legal age, and that you cannot be, in modern parlance, what we would say senile, like so old and in your dotage is the term, that you're not capable of understanding your obligations. But for the physical infirmities, there are still really old laws on the books for the grandmaster where you can ask for a petition in case someone has been crippled or something like that. But I don't know of any example in relatively modern history where anyone's actually applied that. They tend to be more lax in enforcing that one because we have different perspectives today on what that counts. The same thing about being a free man is kind of outdated at that point, but it's still on the books.
Right. Well, they don't literally ask you, are you currently a slave, or were you born a slave? That's kind of what's implied by that, but it's not really. I mean, nobody alive today in the U.S. is a slave, setting aside the people in sex trafficking circles, and I'm sure that exists, and none of them are out petitioning lodges. So unfortunately, those people do exist there, but that doesn't really count in that sense. Brother Brian, did you have a question or?
I think David is before me.
Okay. Brother David?
Oh, no, sorry, hit the wrong key. Yeah, I appreciate you guys explaining it to me.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're here to provide education, and by all means, I'm happy to get into these topics. And I know I'll go on at length. Some of you may say I'm going on too long, but I want to explain to where you go away understanding it. All right, Brother Brian, go ahead.
Just to highlight actually a difference again between the UK and America. A disabled Mason is very welcome. In fact, we'll make provision for them. Our lodges have got stair lifts in them. We'll have someone go around the lodge for them if they can't go around the lodge.
Okay.
We'll do whatever we can to sort of make them fully inclusive in the lodge. My last worshipful master was actually brain damaged. He was blown up in Northern Ireland. And so he had a tablet which he used all the way through. And the past master sat beside him and prompted him. So our view from disability is completely different.
Right. Well, we got our traditions from you, brother. So you're the one who had the idea.
Yeah, we grew up.
Maybe.
We grew up.
And I understand. I mean, if we look at it from the historical standpoint, and this is a full topic in itself about literally what operative and speculative means, but from the premise that to be an operative Mason, if we go with the assumption that we were actually a stonemasons guild, that if you wanted to be a Mason, you worked with your hands, literally. And if you're a cripple, however you want to phrase it, you weren't going to be much use to somebody building a temple if you can't actually stand up and work the tools and all that. So there'd be no use for you to join an operative lodge of Masons because you can't physically work. And they sort of carry that tradition on into the speculative, when literally the only thing is you couldn't actually perform the signs and the movements of an initiation. Well, there was one case, I will say a case in my lodge where we had a brother who was, he was well along in years and he had like back issues and what all, and we initiated him and he basically assumed the position on the altar. And as soon as he did, we had a chair right behind it and he got up and he sat in the chair for the obligation. And we felt that was sufficient. He took the form one time, so we understood what it meant. And then he got to sit in a folding chair right in front of the altar and took the whole obligation. So he wasn't in that uncomfortable position for the length of the obligation. But he fully understood and he did actually assume it. And of course he was able to make the signs after. It's just that he couldn't kneel for that length of time. But that's, I mean, that's a simple accommodation. You give him a chair to sit in, but he did at least form it once. Well, I don't know. I see the reasoning for still holding on to it, but if my Grand Lodge decided to set that aside, I don't see where not having a finger is a reason to keep someone from being a Mason. I mean, that's just, I guess someone being a stickler, and I don't even know if that's come up. I haven't seen too many Masons that don't have all their fingers, but they did exist out there. So I don't know. It's one of those things we sort of hang on to. And I guess at some point, if someone thinks, like anything else, if someone thinks that what we're doing doesn't make sense anymore, at some point enough people will stand up and say, hey, let's put in a resolution to remove that requirement. And then the Grand Lodge votes on it and all the members vote. And then it's changed. And that's how you go about changing it. And if it's not enough of a deal for everyone, we pretty much leave it just like it is until somebody thinks it's a big enough deal to push it through the Grand Lodge and vote. That's another topic we should have sometime, is how jurisprudence works in each of the different Grand Lodge. Because I would love to hear from your other Grand Lodges how your jurisprudence goes about. How do we make changes in each Grand Lodge? Because I'm sure there's a lot of variety there. You know, I know what the rules are in Virginia. I'm very familiar with them, but I'd love to see how it is in these other jurisdictions, just to see how we're similar and how it changes. It'd be an eye opener. Any other brother, anything to offer? We covered a lot of interesting topics. I think this is great. This is what I like about our Zoom meetings, is people bring up stuff and we go off on tangents, but we all learn a little bit more. I think it's pretty cool. It's why we're here. But any other want to bring something up? We're at 11:30 already, so I want to go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, I thank you for answering all my questions. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Brother Irwin, you haven't said much. Why don't you go and say hello and say something before we sign off? You've been quiet this whole time.
Well, I'm just an EA, so I'm new into the craft.
Okay.
And so like we went Darko a year ago up here in Canada, ours anyway.
Okay.
So all we've been doing is like a weekly Sunday morning chat with maybe 10 or 12 of our lodge. So there's not a lot of education going on with it. So like I'm learning more with this morning ritual and reading others. So I'm more in the background and listening because I don't have a lot to offer really.
Oh, that's great. No, that's perfectly fine. And this is something you are an example of why we're doing this, because honestly, for lodges that aren't really meeting, and even back when we were meeting, I'm always a little dismayed when I'm in, like, okay, most of y'all, if you're on Facebook, you're probably members of the Winding Staircase or Proud to be a Freemason or some of the other non-groups, non-lodge specific Masonic groups out there. There are a lot of them out there that are just generically for Masons, like Proud to be a Freemason. And they get into a lot of discussions there. And they get into discussions, okay, I'm sorry, they get into discussions over the stupidest things, like points in, points out, and other dumb ideas like how do you wear your ring? And I don't know. But it seems those are the ones that get the most response. But I see brothers posting on there with questions that really you should be asking in your lodge. You shouldn't be going on a Facebook group and saying, hey, when do I pay my dues? I mean, literally, or like, where does the senior warden sit? Things like that. It's like, you know what? If you don't know the answer, your first question should be to your lodge, because I get dismayed because I am a big proponent of Masonic education. I think every new member, like Brother Mark and Brother David, would be examples of, if you're in my lodge, I would spend time with you after the degrees, talking to you, answering questions, and making sure you understood all of the stuff that most of us just take for granted, but just the operating policies of your lodge. And they may well be different depending on the lodge you're in and depending on the Grand Lodge you're under. Because I could tell you something that's not the truth in your Grand Lodge. And if you were to post on a Facebook group saying, you know, where do the columns go? Do they go behind the senior warden or the junior warden? That actually varies depending on your Grand Lodge. And if you ask me, I'm going to answer you based on what my Grand Lodge says, and that may well be wrong for you. So it dismays me, I guess, that so many brothers are not getting the answers in their lodge, and they're going online asking these simple questions, and they're going to get incorrect information because every Grand Lodge is slightly different. Your jurisdiction may vary, as I say. But that's the thing. And I can give general answers here that I think are true everywhere. But it's kind of like, I wish more of you, not you guys in particular, but I wish more newer members would either your lodge is not doing its job telling you what you need to know, or you're not asking them first. And that kind of, it grates on me a little bit. But with COVID and all that, we're not really meeting, so I'm not as harsh now. But really, I'm happy to answer stuff here. And I'm glad that you have enough of an interest that you're making an effort to attend things beyond your lodge and that you're learning stuff. And I do hope you go back to your lodge and say, hey, we talked about this, and say, you know, is this how we do it? Is this right with how we are? And they may give you answers that are different, but that's what's right for your lodge. So that's something I try and put a caveat on. I try very hard to be generic, and when I'm talking about something that applies to Masonry on a universal sense and not married to one Grand Lodge. Or I'll specifically say, in Virginia, we do X. And that's not to say that your Grand Lodge does it the same way. They may not. And that's something you have to remember when you're asking online, is ask your lodge first and say, this is a cool thing I learned. How are we the different or same as what the guy from Virginia was telling me? Because I think that's how you grow. But I really wish every Mason was interested enough in education to seek out these things, to seek out these opportunities and learn more about Masonry. I got into it early on. I joined research lodges soon after I joined. I know Masons who have almost no interest in education. They really haven't made an effort to get active in a research lodge, or, you know, they're just missing out. And I've seen a lot of lodges that don't bother to hold educational papers. Every meeting, there should be some kind of Masonic education going on. So we're filling a much needed gap out there, and I'm really happy to be part of that. And that's why I enjoy doing this so much, is sharing with other brothers and sharing the education. And hopefully it spreads, and you tell your friends and they tell their friends, and, you know, you all seek more. So it's really cool to see EAs and fellow crafts and even candidates. I don't turn people away who aren't Master Masons, because you're making more of an effort to educate yourself than guys who've been Masons for like 10 years. So, you know, you're the students we want. You're the guys we want. You're seeking it out. We want to provide it to you, and as much variety in our education as we can, because it makes me feel good knowing you guys are out there looking for information. So you're ahead of the crowd. All right. So if there's nothing else, I'm going to go and wrap it up. Unless any brother has anything left to say before we close out. It's 11:45. I love how we go long, but this is going to be a long YouTube video like all the other ones.
Actually, just one question. Do you know what the topic is for next Saturday yet?
Yes, absolutely it is. It is, thank you. I wanted to mention that. It is a panel discussion. It's the, let me get the actual title here. It is called Brothers in Barongs, Masonry in the Philippines. I'm going to be interviewing, I think, 6 or 7 Filipino brothers, or brothers who attend lodge in the Philippines. Most of them are Masons here in Virginia, but they go back home to the Philippines. So this is our second attempt to talk to brothers from a specific Grand Lodge. Most of y'all were not there when I interviewed the brothers from Brazil, that was a lot of fun. So this is all about Filipino masonry, and we're going to kind of contrast and compare what American and North American masonry is like, because I think Canada is similar to the US, but we're going to explore that too at some point. We'll interview Canadians, but most Virginia Grand Lodges are similar in their makeup. The Philippines are different in their masonry, and we want to kind of delve into what it's like attending lodge in the Philippines with brothers who attend regularly. The Philippines is one of those countries where brothers come to America, whether they're raised there or raised in the US, and they regularly travel back to the Philippines, because if you're making American money, you can live pretty good in the Philippines. So you can vacation there and get a lot of bang for your buck. And of course, their families are there. They have relatives who are still there. Filipinos are a class of Americans that they become American citizens, but they still have very strong ties back to their homeland, and they go back routinely to visit. That's part of their culture, more so that I've noticed than most other people. Most of us, I came here, my grandparents came here from Germany and Sweden, and they stayed. We never went back. So, but a lot of people, some people do. Culturally, the Filipinos visit a lot. And I thought it'd be really cool to delve into just the day-to-day, what Filipino masonry is like, and contrast it to primarily American masonry. And those of you from Canada and the UK and all, you'll see how it contrasts to your kind of masonry. So that's always a lot of fun. I got about 6 or 7 people sign up with the panelists, and I'm just going to go around and ask them questions, and we'll delve into Filipino masonry. And hope you all can attend that. It should be a lot of fun. And I plan to do one of those at least like once a month, have one of these panels and just pick a different country and get at least 2 or 3 brothers from that country and ask them similar questions about how things are there. So that's kind of one of the things I want to, this isn't something anybody else is really doing that I've seen. Other Zoom meetings have papers, and that's great. And that's going to be a staple, is like today, have someone present a research paper and we talk about that topic. But I haven't seen anyone else do these kind of panel things. So I'm kind of proud to be one of the first ones to break ground and do this. And there's no formal, it's not a paper. It's just me asking questions of the brothers and trying to learn more about about how they do things in that country, under that Grand Lodge. And it's really enlightening. We learn a lot. I learn a lot when we do these. So I'm happy to be able to bring it to y'all. So that's what we're doing. Thank you all. You all have a wonderful day. Unless anybody else got something to say, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you all next Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.